The United Nations Convention Against Corruption is the major treaty guiding anti-corruption works worldwide. However, it does not explicitly define corruption. The treaty, which entered into force in December 2005, includes, though, a series of offenses that should be criminalized and fall under its jurisdiction. The purpose of this convention are the purpose of this convention, that is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, is to promote and strengthen measures to prevent and combat corruption more effectively and efficiently, to promote, facilitate, and support international cooperation and technical assistance in the prevention of and fight against corruption, including in asset recovery, and to promote integrity, accountability, and proper management of public affairs and public property. Unlike the unlike this UN convention, Transparency International and the World Bank appear to have no qualms about defining this scourge. TI defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, whereas the WB, that is the World Bank, describes corruption as the abuse of public office for private gain. In its website, transparency.org, Transparency International further states corruption erodes trust, weakens democracy, hampers economic development, and further exacerbates inequality, poverty, social division, and the environmental crisis. Exposing corruption and holding the corrupt to account can only happen if we understand the way corruption works and that enables it, the systems that enable it. The World Bank states in its website, that is worldbank.org, that it considers corruption as a major challenge to its twin goals of ending extreme poverty by 2030 and boosting shared prosperity for the poorest 40% of people in developing countries. The World Bank adds, corruption has a disproportionate impact on the poor and most vulnerable, increasing costs and reducing access to services, including health, education, and justice. Corruption in the procurement of drugs and medical equipment drives up costs and can lead to substandard or harmful products. The human costs of counterfeit drugs and vaccinations on health outcomes and the lifelong impacts on children far exceed the financial costs. Unofficial payments for services can have a particularly pernicious effect on poor people. J.S. Nye describes corruption as behavior which deviates from the formal duties of a public role because of private regarding personal, close, family, private clique pecuniary or status gains, or violates rules against the exercise of certain types of private regarding influence. Drawing from these definitions, one can conclude that corruption is a scourge. It's a scourge that can cause the multiple organ failure of states, lead to their ultimate collapse, and threaten the world order as well. The question is how it works, how this corruption, this global scourge works. Let's delve a deep, let's delve a bit into this question. It takes two to tango, as the saying goes, but corruption, policy corruption in particular, is way more complex than the famous Argentinian ballroom dance. Corruption seems to have given even King Prithvinarayan Saha, one of the reunifiers of Nepal, modern Nepal, a pretty hard time. Otherwise, why would the powerful king declare through his Divyopades, that is, divine preachings, why would the king declare through his Divyopades that the givers and the recipients of bribes were the biggest enemies of this country? The great king's take on bribery is a pointer. It's a pointer to a chronic and stubborn scourge sapping this country of its energies for ages. Corruption, policy corruption in particular, has been plaguing Nepal even after the epochal political changes of the 1950s, the 1990s, and the 2000s, effected on the strength of popular movements launched for higher ideals like democracy, national sovereignty, human dignity, human rights, and transparency. What do major scandals, what do the major scandals witnessed since the 1950s point at? They point at institutionalization. They point at the institutionalization of corruption through a rigged polity, marked by weakening of the very walls separating the organs of the state and the system of checks and balances. It's a rigged system that has been behind huge corruption scandals in Nepal. Of course, there are various authorities in place, including the Commission for the Investigation of Abuse of Authority, the courts, and law enforcement agencies to take on corruption, to take on this stubborn and persistent scourge. But all these agencies, all these state organs lack teeth when it comes to dealing with policy corruption. On top of it, whenever a major scam unravels, the government of the day swiftly constitutes commissions and committees to get to the root, identify the guilty, and initiate legal action against them. Whenever such scandals unravel, the government forms commissions and committees in the name of getting to the root of that scandal, in the name of identifying the guilty and initiating swift legal action against those involved. But What do the recent investigations into those scams point at? They point into some of the most, like, what do those investigations into some of the most high profile scams point at? One may wonder. These investigations clearly show that the long arm of the law, it falls short. It falls short when it comes to bringing the apex predators. Remember my words, the apex predators of the complex food web, the complex food web called policy corruption under the ambit of law. Those in high places, those involved, those neck deep in corruption, those who wield political influence, they are always above the law, and even the high profile investigations cannot point fingers at them, let alone bring them under the ambit of law. Interestingly, such investigations have never covered several treasonous binational treaties and agreements effected with the consent of the sovereign parliament. The consent can be manufactured or otherwise. Most of the times it's manufactured in this rigged polity, effected with the consent of the sovereign parliament, manufactured or otherwise, or without the consent, of the sovereign parliament, to take care of those vested interests. These investigations have never bothered to just look into, dig deeper into those treasonous deals and treaties effected with by scamming the parliament itself, by rigging the parliamentary process itself. So it's like limited to some financial dealings, suspicious transactions, and all. And it's always the small fish that are caught, while the big ones are like allowed to go scot free. My point is that these committees, these investigations should also dig deeper into treasonous binational deals and treaties, and take, take stringent action against those found guilty. That is my point. Let's also just take note of the Transparency International, International's annual reports. These reports show Nepal in an unenviable position in terms of the Global Corruption Perception Index, that is CPI, with a score ranging from 27 to 35 out of 100. That's not even a pass mark. So we are like in a very unenviable position when it comes to taking on corruption, when it comes to controlling corruption. This is hardly surprising. This is hardly surprising. This poor swing in the corruption perception index is hardly surprising in a society that worships power and wealth, regarding the rich and the powerful people as Thula Manche, the great people, without bothering to do a background check on such people, the sources of their power and their wealth, etc., while the holders of highest public offices responsible for making final decisions in cases of policy corruption go scot-free, the law unevenly applies to subordinate functionaries involved in paperwork in almost all of the cases. So, what is the way forward? What is the way out of this scenario? What is the way out of this crisis? The weakening of the walls, I was already talking about it. I talked a bit about the weakening of the walls that separate the state organs. It's a very worrisome syndrome affecting the Nepali polity. It's in fact a disease. The weakening of the walls separating the principal organs of the state and the system of checks and balances. What does it mean? It means that the state lacks the will to take on corruption head on, policy corruption in particular. What does this call for? This calls for those crusading against corruption, those fighting corruption with that missionary zeal, including jurists, journalists, retired law enforcement officials, politicians, and retired bureaucrats to constitute an ombudsman, probe all major cases of policy corruption since the 1950s in a free, fair, and transparent manner, and make the findings public as part of a relentless campaign against corruption. Let's hope that this move will put our fledgling state under tremendous moral pressure to act really tough against corruption. With this remark, I wrap up this edition of Soft Talk. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.